Hey everyone, so I have a little bit of a channeled message today on the topic of truth, and this is in relation to how we may sometimes perceive ourselves as being in, if not disagreement, then maybe just feeling like we want to understand somebody else's position a little bit better, and a whole bunch of related issues around our understanding in relation to our understanding of truth. Now, typically, I think when we speak, we often think about truth in terms of, for example, a polarity of like true and false, or in terms of like it's something external to us that is very discrete and it's something that we can confirm or not, like a box we can check off, or we can kind of do some kind of like computation on a statement and then it produces an outcome of like either true or false. And that's kind of a really binary and like low dimensional way to think about truth. And I think it was this morning, I had a very clear vision, and I'm not saying this is original. In fact, it's not for sure. It's been documented already in, some kind of like complexity science journal. But an alternative paradigm for thinking about truth is to consider it as an infinitely dense state space in which everyone is taking their own different path or sequence through this state space. And there are, maybe it's not infinite, but there's a very dense amount of different points within this space which we arrive at as a truth that we experience. And so, if you're not familiar, this language and vocabulary is coming from complexity science, from chaos theory, from thermodynamics. And basically, a state space is just sort of a collection of all the possible positions, so to speak, that can be in a given context that has meaning for us. And one of the images that has been coming through for me is really about the different ways that we arrive at truth. And so that's already encoded into the way we speak, right? We will often hear, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And in that language already, there's this notion of like a path that we're taking, and then we're arriving at a specific point or destination. Now, I've talked a little bit about this on my Instagram, and I'm doing a longer article for this for my Substack, so you can check that out. I'll probably be linking to this video as well. But basically, the idea is that truth can be either like this, we can see it as this destination that we arrive at, and also as a specific pathway that we take to arrive at that destination. And similarly, we can see it as an outcome as well as a specific process that we go through. And so these are both valid. Now, this does also connect with a couple of videos I've done previously on the relation that we have between truth and time. So our own experience of time being really intimately embedded in, or the medium of our ability to arrive at truths, our own truths, to admit our own light to ourselves, basically. And so everyone will have their own pathway through their own truth space, and a lot more needs to be developed here around like, are these spaces shared? Like, what constitutes boundaries on the total truth space? But the essential point here that I've been getting is just the difference in the paths for arriving at specific truths, and how we can each arrive at the same point. We just took different paths to get there, right? This sounds obvious. But I feel that a lot of times when we're looking at like how we're understanding something, or we want to make sure we're understanding somebody else, we may confuse these two. Like, we may confuse whether or not we are at the same point of truth, or we might want to talk about ordered patterns of truth, or whether we're just missing something about how the person arrived at a certain truth, right? What other conditions they had to work through. And I just feel that this is a very subtle point. So this may go over a lot of people's heads. Like, this may just sound too abstract, and I get it. But I feel like the subtle point here is that sometimes we don't necessarily need to know the pathway to a specific truth point. So we need to really just discern when we're looking at one or the other. And I feel that what's really valuable here, or can be better understood, is that sometimes we may be looking at real complexities of truth. So maybe we're looking at a certain kind of ordered pattern, and maybe there's disagreement about one of the points in that pattern. And so we kind of like, it's almost like we need to check each other's work to see, like, okay, so what was the pathway that got you to that point? Like, why are you including this point in the pattern, whereas I'm not, or whereas most people are not? And so I feel like when we examine that pathway, it may be that we have just personally never traversed any of the points on that particular pathway. So again, if this is like a nearly infinitely dense space, like that's totally possible, right? So we do have a legitimate basis for like wondering how someone arrived at a certain idea or conclusion. Like we want to know almost like the provenance of that kind of lineage, so to speak. And because maybe we just legitimately, none of our pathways ever needed to go through those points. So there's a legitimate reason for inquiring into that. And similarly, though, I think there's cases where maybe that just never comes up. Like we are at a similar truth point, or there's no inconsistency in the pattern that we're both sharing or talking about. And so we never need to really like involve like what path it took to get there. And here is the last part of my metaphor, basically. And it's just this idea that if there are these totally different pathways for arriving at a similar truth, and for any given lifetime, for example, you may never need to experience, or you may never get the chance to experience so many of those other path points. So there is a legitimate basis for wanting to create a kind of connection or a literal bridge between these different sequences in a given state space. Again, I know this sounds like really abstract language, but if you've already read some complexity science, Prigogine, or thermodynamics, you know what I'm talking about. This is actually really cool. It's actually a very precise and adaptable model for talking about like almost anything, and I think it's still really understudied. So I do recommend reading up on any kind of like chaos theory, complexity science, absolutely. But I feel like we need to put a lot more like recognition and emphasis on this bridge building process, because for any given person, there's just no way you're never going to experience all of these other points, these other paths that you might travel. And I just think there's a lot of like untapped knowledge and richness in being able to create some of those bridges. And another key point here in terms of like relating with other people, maybe some people are just more ontologically oriented towards what you can do with a certain collection of truth points, like a certain pattern, a certain ordered pattern, and then where you go from there. And it may not be necessary to kind of like, it may look like backtracking, like to actually have to question like how you arrived somewhere. Whereas bridge builders, it's kind of a more open-ended process of creation, right? Because once you have a bridge, now you're like amplifying what was already such a dense sequence space. And that just like amplifies the creative possibilities and the possibilities for more understanding. So I just think it's worth keeping that in mind. And it's all about also like where we want to spend our energy, right? Where we think it's worth spending our energy. Like, is it worth it to build a bridge? I mean, maybe in some cases some people don't see that that's what's happening, or don't need it, or they're not interested, or but in other cases, obviously, if you're a bridge builder, you get it. Like, this is also a fundamental level of creation. And I just want to add, just in case, again, because this can sound so abstract or like someone's spinning their wheels, that's not what this is about. Because very literally, I feel like doing more of this kind of like bridge building thinking or pathway reconstruction kind of thinking can really help mitigate against feelings of like something being like it is the way it is, or this is inevitable, or any kind of thing like don't question such and such, because it's just not true, right? Like it's not the definitive answer or the definitive set of conditions for how we arrived anywhere. So you can kind of, it's not backtracking, it's just literally uncovering all the conditions, uncovering all the so-called priors, uncovering all the assumptions. And if you can make translations between a lot of those pathways, there are such an expanded amount of other kinds of possibilities. And so I feel that a lot of people who like are kind of core root artists and writers and anyone in this kind of like core space of artistry already gets this intuitively, right? We came in with it. It's not something we picked up because now we have AI available on our desktop or something. Um, so I just feel like, yeah, just going back to this like bridge building consciousness, we need more emphasis there, and it will just go so far in terms of like allowing us to imagine other possibilities, to get out of this um, tendency of feeling like so locked in, like feeling locked into a specific paradigm, making it easier to really like question the conditions of a certain pattern that we're working with, and then like moving out of it and choosing something else. And also on a personal level or interpersonal level, don't feel bad or don't feel shame because the path that you took for arriving at a certain set of truth points may not overlap at all with how someone else did. So if you're like questioning or you're interested or you're asking for clarification or something just doesn't feel like it matches up between the two pathways, that's not necessarily like a conflict. That's not being in disagreement. That's like nothing to feel ashamed about if you are interested or care about it. um Sometimes it's not necessary to know, or sometimes like it's very enriching to know, and it's also just okay to just accept that you're at the same truth point however you got there. So, and I just want to add one little thought here that I just went into, because I feel that, if you know my channel, I talk a lot about neurocomplexity and just having a higher receptivity, people with higher sensitivity. We call it neurosensitivity, high capacity perceptive individuals. I feel that for us, it may be more common that we will want to understand a pathway or sequence for arriving at a certain truth rather than like just being concerned with the truth itself. So it's almost like having a different kind of lens, right? Like seeing further into the material. So maybe we have like an X-ray or other types of imaging devices, that can kind of like really cut through the surface layers of the visible world and measure different things, right? Temperature, density, you know, infrared frequencies and these kinds of things. And, there are important limits to all of that, but I just feel it's a useful way of thinking about why some people might be more interested in those kinds of details than others. Just literally having like more capacity or desire for that level of complexity or depth, which isn't to say that there's no depth in other ways or methods or elsewhere, but it just may explain why some of us may not be satisfied with like just assertions or simple declarations of a given truth, but just need to know a little bit more about what composes that truth, right? To truly feel like we understand it and to understand the paradigm that it's coming from and so on. I hope that helps. I hope this has been insightful in some way. This is definitely kind of a semi-channeled message. It's like some images and ideas that I was getting very clearly this morning. And I just feel that it was worth trying to bring this through on a video message. I didn't like try to write this out as a really clean argument or something in advance. I'm just trying to explain it as I go. So let me know if this like hit any light bulbs for you or sparks any other ideas. And thanks for listening, and do check out the other videos that I'm linking to this. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.